He should not have said it in front of the entire executive board. But once the words left Victoria Langford's mouth, there was no pulling them back. "You've been seeing my daughter behind my back." The conference room went silent, not the polite silence of professionals waiting for someone to finish a sentence. This was the kind that sucked the air out of your lungs. Every pair of eyes turned toward me. I felt the weight of a dozen executives watching, waiting. Victoria Langford stood at the head of the table, perfectly composed as always, tailored gray suit, hands resting lightly on the polished glass surface. The same calm expression she wore when negotiating million-dollar contracts. Except this time she wasn't negotiating. She was looking directly at me. And the worst part, she wasn't asking a question she already knew. I cleared my throat slowly. "Victoria, I didn't know she was your daughter." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Victoria's eyebrow lifted slightly, the way it always did when someone said something she found mildly ridiculous. "Of course you didn't," she said evenly. "But you know now." The silence thickened. For a brief moment I wondered if my career had just ended, because dating the CEO's daughter wasn't exactly in the Langford Media employee handbook, and yet the truth was worse than any rumor in that room. I hadn't planned to fall for her, not even a little, but once it started, I couldn't stop. Victoria studied me for another long second. Then she said something that made my heart pound even harder. "So tell me, James." Her voice was calm, too calm. "Was it worth it?" That question followed me the entire way back to my office, because the truth was complicated, and if I was honest with myself, it started months earlier, with a dinner I never wanted to attend. My name is James Carter, and at 32 years old I believed my life was exactly where it should be. Senior account manager at Langford Media, corner office, strong salary, a reputation for delivering results when clients were on the verge of walking away. In the world of Chicago advertising, that reputation mattered. Langford Media was one of the most aggressive agencies in the city. We handled billion-dollar brands and impossible deadlines. People burned out quickly under that pressure, but I didn't. I thrived on it. And the reason most people survived at Langford at all came down to one person. Victoria Langford, CEO, founder, force of nature. Working under her was like standing next to a hurricane that somehow wore designer suits. She demanded perfection, expected loyalty, and somehow managed to run the entire company like a chessboard where every piece moved exactly where she wanted it. For 4 years, I had been one of those pieces. A valuable one, if her praise during quarterly reviews meant anything, which is why I should have been more careful the day she first mentioned her daughter. It happened during a routine performance review. I sat across from Victoria in her glass office overlooking the Chicago River while she flipped through a report of my client results. "Your numbers are strong," she said without looking up. "3 major accounts retained this quarter." "Thank you," I replied. Then she leaned back in her chair and looked at me, not like a boss reviewing an employee, more like someone evaluating a business opportunity. "James," she said casually, "you're 32. "Yes. And still single." I smiled politely. "I suppose that's accurate. A man like you should have someone by now." The comment caught me slightly off guard, but Victoria often said strange things when she was thinking. "I've been busy with work," I said. She gave a small, knowing smile. "Work will always be busy." Then she closed the file. "My daughter just moved back to Chicago." The moment those words left her mouth, I knew exactly where the conversation was going, and I didn't like it. "She's 29, Victoria continued. "Brilliant, works in sustainable design." I cleared my throat. "Victoria, you two would get along." There it was, the setup. I tried to shut it down immediately. "I appreciate the thought," I said carefully, "but mixing personal life with work probably isn't a good idea." Victoria's smile didn't change. "It's just dinner." "Still, one dinner." She folded her hands on the desk. "If it doesn't work, we never speak of it again." That should have been the end of it. But anyone who worked for Victoria Langford knew one important thing. She never dropped an idea once it entered her mind. Over the next 2 weeks, the topic returned again and again, sometimes casually during meetings, sometimes in passing comments, once even during a team dinner where she mentioned K.H. Lowe's name in front of half the executive staff. Each time, the pressure grew a little stronger, until eventually the situation became obvious. This wasn't a suggestion, it was an expectation. And repeatedly saying no to the most powerful person in the company wasn't exactly a sustainable career move. So eventually, I gave in. One dinner, that was the deal. I would go, be polite, spend an hour making small talk, and then we would both tell Victoria it had been pleasant but not a match. Simple, clean, professional. At least that's what I told myself the night I arrived at the Sterling. The Sterling was one of those upscale Chicago restaurants designed for expensive conversations. Dim lighting, white linen tablecloths, wine lists that read like small novels. I arrived 10 minutes early, navy suit, black tie, trying not to feel like I was walking into a carefully arranged trap. A host led me to a reserved table near the back. I sat down and checked my watch. 7:02 p.m. She was late. I was just beginning to think about leaving when the front door opened. And she walked in. K.H. Lowe Langford didn't look like the kind of woman I expected the daughter of Victoria Langford to be. No designer gown, no dramatic entrance, no obvious attempt to impress anyone. She wore a simple black blouse tucked into beige trousers. Her dark hair fell loosely over one shoulder. And somehow, she looked completely comfortable in a room full of people trying too hard. Her eyes scanned the restaurant, then they landed on me. She walked over slowly, a small, slightly apologetic smile on her face. "James?" she asked. "That's me," I said, standing. "K.H. Lowe." She shook my hand, guilty as charged. For the first 30 seconds after we sat down, neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavy, awkward, exactly what I had expected. Then she leaned back in her chair and sighed. "So." She gave me a tired smile. "My mother forced you into this too, huh?" I blinked, then laughed before I could stop myself. "Multiple times." K.H. Lowe shook her head. "I told her I didn't want this." I raised an eyebrow. "She told me it was just one dinner." K.H. Lowe laughed softly. "Word for word." Something about that moment changed the atmosphere immediately. The tension disappeared. She leaned forward slightly. "Look," she said honestly, "I don't want to waste your evening. How about we stay for an hour, eat a decent meal, and then both go home and tell my mother it was fine?" I smiled. "Fine. Fine is safe. Fine won't make her push harder. And fine means we both get our lives back." I couldn't help it. I liked her already. "Deal," I said. 1 hour. She extended her hand across the table. "Temporary alliance." I shook it. "Temporary alliance." And at that moment, neither of us realized that the one dinner we planned to escape was about to change both of our lives completely. Strange thing about that dinner was how quickly the plan stopped feeling like a plan. It was supposed to be simple. 1 hour, polite conversation, two people cooperating to survive Victoria Langford's matchmaking experiment. But somewhere between the appetizers and the main course, the evening stopped feeling like an obligation. It started feeling easy. The waiter arrived with menus, and K.H. Lowe barely glanced at hers before closing it again. "I come here sometimes with clients," she said casually. "The salmon is good." I raised an eyebrow. "You say that like you've done reconnaissance." She smiled slightly. "Growing up with my mother teaches you to study situations before you walk into them." That sounds intense. It was. We placed our orders, and for a moment the conversation drifted into safe territory. Chicago traffic, the ridiculous price of downtown apartments, favorite coffee spots. But after a while, K.H. Lowe rested her chin lightly on her hand and looked at me more carefully. "So," she said, "how long have you been working for my mother?" "Almost 4 years." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. And you're still sane. Debatable. She laughed quietly. I mean it, she said. Most people last 6 months. She's demanding, I admitted. But she's also one of the smartest people I've ever met. Khlo nodded slowly. That's the problem. I frowned. How is that a problem? She leaned back slightly in her chair. Because when someone that smart decides they know what's best for everyone else, they usually stop listening. There was no anger in her voice, just something softer, something tired. I chose my words carefully. She talks about you a lot at the office. Khlo's eyes narrowed with amusement. That's terrifying. Mostly good things. Mostly. I smiled. She's proud of you. That seemed to surprise her. For a moment she looked down at the tablecloth, running a finger along the folded linen. She's proud of what she planned, Khlo said quietly. What do you mean? She planned everything. Her voice stayed calm, but I could hear the history behind it. My school, my career, my schedule growing up, the people I spent time with. She gave a small shrug. Sometimes I think my entire life was mapped out before I was even born. The waiter returned with our food, briefly interrupting the conversation. For a few minutes we focused on eating, but the tone between us had shifted. The polite small talk had been replaced by something more honest. So what about you? Khlo asked eventually. What about me? You're 32, successful, apparently patient enough to survive working for my mother. She studied me curiously. Why are you still single? I hesitated. There were a lot of answers to that question, but only one honest one. I was in a relationship a few years ago, I said finally. What happened? I chose work. Khlo nodded slowly, like she understood more than I expected. That happens a lot in Chicago. But she deserved someone who showed up more than I did. And now? I shrugged. Now I'm better at my job. She gave me a look that said she didn't entirely accept that answer, but she didn't push. Instead, she started telling me about her own work, sustainable design, urban projects, buildings that used less energy and produced less waste. Her eyes lit up when she talked about it, not the polite enthusiasm people use when describing their careers, real passion. Portland was amazing for that kind of work, she said. People actually care about environmental design there. So why move back to Chicago? She stirred her water slowly. My mother. She didn't ask, Khlo added. She just suggested very strongly that family should be closer. That sounds familiar. She smiled faintly. It always does. By the time we finished dinner, I realized something surprising. The hour we had agreed on had already passed. Neither of us had noticed. Khlo checked her watch. Well, she said, that was better than expected. Same. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. So, what do we tell her? I thought for a moment. We tell her the truth. Khlo raised an eyebrow, which is that we had a nice dinner, that we talked, and that we'll see where it goes. Her expression turned thoughtful. That's vague. Exactly. She'll assume it means potential, which buys us time. Khlo smiled slowly. I like the way you think, James. We paid the bill and walked outside together. The Chicago night air was cool, the city lights reflecting across the river like scattered glass. At the valet stand, she turned toward me. Thank you, she said, for not making that painful. Thank you for not being what I expected. Her eyes sparkled. What did you expect? Someone more like your mother. She laughed. I'll take that as a compliment. Her car arrived a minute later. Before getting in, she paused. Temporary alliance still active? She asked. I smiled. Temporary alliance. She nodded once. Then she drove away. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, and that's when I realized something uncomfortable. I was still thinking about her smile. 4 days passed before I saw her again. but it wasn't by accident. The next morning, Victoria Langford called me into her office. She didn't even pretend to look at the reports on her desk. Instead, she watched me with that sharp, observant gaze. K.H. Lowe said you had a lovely dinner. I kept my tone neutral. It was pleasant. She also said you're seeing each other again this weekend. My mouth opened slightly, but Victoria raised a hand. Don't disappoint me, James. That was how I found myself sitting at a quiet cafe in Wicker Park the following Saturday afternoon. Neutral ground, less formal, less pressure. At least that's what I told myself. K.H. Lowe arrived 10 minutes late wearing a loose cream sweater and dark jeans. Her hair was down, slightly windblown. She looked more relaxed than she had at the restaurant. Sorry I'm late, she said, sliding into the chair across from me. Traffic. No problem. She ordered an oat milk latte. I stuck with black coffee. For the first few minutes, we stayed in safe conversation again. Weather, work, a ridiculous story about Victoria trying to set her up with another perfect candidate. But then K.H. Lowe stirred her latte slowly and looked at me more seriously. So, how much pressure did my mother put on you to agree to this second meeting? I considered lying, then decided honesty was easier. Enough that saying no wasn't really an option. She nodded like she'd expected that answer. I figured. She took a sip of her drink, then leaned forward slightly. Okay, she said, let us be real with each other. I like real. I'm only here because my mother won't stop asking questions if I don't show progress. Fair. But I'm not looking for a relationship right now. Her tone was calm, matter of fact. My life is complicated, she continued, and I don't want to drag someone else into it. I studied her for a moment, then why meet me again? She gave a small, self-aware smile, because the first dinner wasn't terrible. That's a low bar. It really is. We both laughed, and just like that, the tension disappeared again. But something about this meeting felt different from the first one. More honest, more real. And sometime during the 2 hours we spent talking in that small cafe, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. This wasn't an alliance anymore. And if I wasn't careful, I might actually start falling for Victoria Langford's daughter. The moment I realized I was in trouble came on a quiet Tuesday night. K.H. Lowe had sent me a photo. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a blurry picture of a sketchbook spread across her kitchen table. Design drawings, coffee stains, a pencil resting across the page. The caption under the photo said one thing, save me. I laughed out loud when I saw it. Then I sent back a voice message. Step 1. Drink more coffee. Step 2. Pretend you meant to design it that way. A minute later, my phone buzzed again. Her reply came instantly. You're very confident for someone who works in advertising. We fake confidence professionally, I wrote back. That small exchange turned into another, then another. And before I realized it, texting K.H. Lowe had become part of my daily routine. Morning messages, random memes in the afternoon, late-night conversations that stretched longer than either of us planned. We still met in person too, sometimes for lunch near my office, sometimes for quiet dinners in neighborhoods far away from the downtown corporate crowd. But my favorite moments were the simple ones. Walks along the lake. No pressure, no expectations, just conversation. The more time I spent with her, the more the version of K.H. Lowe I had imagined before that first dinner disappeared. She wasn't intimidating like her mother. She wasn't guarded the way I expected. She was sharp, funny, stubborn, and surprisingly honest once she trusted someone. And she challenged me constantly. One night while we walked along the Chicago Riverwalk, she stopped mid-conversation and looked at me seriously. You're hiding something. I blinked. What? You deflect every time someone asks about your life outside work. That's not true. She folded her arms. James. Yes. You've asked me about my childhood, my career, my terrible ex-boyfriend, my coffee addiction. Valid topics. but every time I ask you something personal, you turn it into a joke." I hesitated. KH Low watched me patiently, not accusing, just waiting, so I answered. "My dad left when I was 10. The words felt strange in my mouth, like something I hadn't said out loud in years. KH Low didn't interrupt. "He walked out one morning," I continued. "Said he needed a fresh start somewhere else." "What? Did he ever come back?" "No." "And your mom?" "She worked 2 jobs to keep things together." I shrugged slightly. I learned early that if I wanted stability, I had to build it myself. KH Low nodded slowly. "That explains the work obsession." "Maybe." We continued walking, but the conversation had shifted again. More open, more honest. At one point our hands brushed. Neither of us pulled away. The contact was small, barely noticeable, but something about it lingered. After that night, things between us changed. We stopped pretending that our meetings were casual. We stopped pretending that this was still just a temporary alliance. Now we were choosing to see each other, because we wanted to. Because somewhere along the way, being around KH Low had stopped feeling complicated. It felt natural. One evening after a long walk along the lakefront, we stopped near the railing overlooking the dark water. The wind pushed strands of her hair across her face. She tucked them behind her ear and looked at me thoughtfully. "You know what's funny?" she said. "What?" I was so sure this was going to be awful. "The blind date." "Yes." She smiled softly. "But being with you, it doesn't feel like pressure anymore." I felt something tighten quietly in my chest. It doesn't feel like pressure to me either. We stood there for a moment, close, not quite touching, but aware of the space between us. The city lights reflected across Lake Michigan like scattered stars. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was racing toward the next achievement. I felt still, but nothing good stays simple forever. The first sign of trouble came a few weeks later. I was sitting at my desk on a Wednesday afternoon reviewing a client proposal when my phone lit up. KH Low. Normally that name appearing on my screen made my day instantly better, but this time something felt different. The message was short. "Can we talk tonight? Something came up." My stomach tightened. "Everything okay?" I replied immediately. Several minutes passed before her answer came. "I'll explain when I see you." That night we met at a small Italian restaurant we'd been to twice before. Usually when KH Low walked into a room, there was an energy about her, a quiet confidence. But tonight that energy was gone. Her shoulders were tense. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. She sat down across from me and didn't waste time. "Lucas is back in Chicago." The name hit me like cold water. Lucas, her ex-boyfriend. The architect she had told me about during our second real conversation. The man she had dated for 4 years. The man who wanted her to abandon her career and move to New York. The man who left when she refused. "He reached out last week," she continued quietly. "He wants to meet." I kept my voice steady. "And what did you tell him?" "I haven't answered yet." She stared down at the table. "I don't know what to do." Dinner that night felt heavier than anything we had experienced before. We tried to talk about other things, but the conversation kept circling back to Lucas. "He was my first real love," KH Low admitted softly. "For a long time I thought we would get married." I nodded slowly, trying not to show how tight my chest felt. "I thought I was over him," she continued. But hearing his voice again, it brought everything back. The honesty in her words hurt more than I expected, not because she was doing anything wrong, but because it reminded me how fragile whatever we had built really was. "What do you want?" I asked finally. She looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw fear in her eyes. "I don't know. Part of me wants to meet him, just to close the chapter. And the other part, I'm scared." "Of what?" "That if I see him again, I'll realize I'm not as over him as I thought." Her words sat between us like something heavy, something neither of us knew how to move. When dinner ended, we walked outside together. Normally we lingered, talked. found excuses not to say goodbye yet. Tonight was different. She hugged me instead of kissing my cheek like she usually did. The hug lasted longer than normal, but something about it felt uncertain, like she was holding on and letting go at the same time. The next morning she sent me a message. I need some time to think. That was all it said. No explanation, no timeline, just space. And I gave it to her, because if I had learned anything about K.H. Lowe Langford, it was that pushing her only made her run faster. So I respected her decision. I didn't call, I didn't text first, but every day without hearing from her felt louder than the one before. At work, Victoria noticed the change immediately. "You've been quiet lately," she said during one of our one-on-one meetings. "Everything all right?" I hesitated, then I told her part of the truth. K.H. Lowe's ex came back to Chicago. Victoria didn't look surprised. She leaned back in her chair and studied me carefully. "She's scared," she said calmly. "I know. Lucas was her first love." "I know." Victoria's voice softened slightly, something I had almost never heard before. "Don't disappear on her, James." I frowned. "I'm giving her space." "Space is fine," Victoria said, "but disappearing is." She folded her hands on the desk. "K.H. Lowe pushes people away when she's afraid." Her eyes met mine. "What she needs most in those moments is someone who stays." Those words stayed with me long after I left her office. Days passed, then weeks, 3 of them, 3 long weeks without hearing from K.H. Lowe, until one rainy Thursday evening. My phone finally lit up. Her name on the screen made my heart jump. The message was simple: "Can we meet tomorrow, Navy Pier, 7 p.m. I stared at the words for a long moment before replying, "I'll be there." But as I set my phone down, one question kept echoing in my mind. Was she coming to say goodbye? Or was she finally ready to choose? I arrived at Navy Pier 20 minutes early, not because I needed the extra time, because waiting somewhere else felt impossible. The wind coming off Lake Michigan was sharp enough to cut through my coat. Waves moved slowly in the dark water, reflecting the scattered lights of the city behind me. Chicago never really slept. But that night the pier felt quieter than usual, like the whole world had stepped back and left the moment alone. I stood near the railing, hands buried in my pockets, watching the water. 3 weeks. That's how long the silence had lasted after K.H. Lowe asked for space. 3 weeks of checking my phone more times than I wanted to admit. 3 weeks of wondering whether the connection we built had simply been temporary. 3 weeks of replaying every conversation in my head. And now she wanted to meet. The question that kept running through my mind was simple. Was she here to close the door or open it again? Footsteps approached behind me. I turned. K.H. Lowe was walking toward me slowly. Her hands were tucked into the sleeves of a long dark coat, shoulders slightly hunched against the wind. The first thing I noticed was how tired she looked. Not physically exhausted, emotionally, like someone who had spent too many nights thinking instead of sleeping. She stopped a few feet away from me. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she said the words I had been expecting. "I met him." Her voice was quiet. "Lucas." I nodded once, letting her continue. 2 days ago." She stepped closer to the railing and looked out at the water. "He apologized." I stayed silent. "He said leaving was the biggest mistake he ever made." What? Her breath left her slowly in the cold air. "He told me he still loves me." The words landed harder than I expected, not because I didn't know they were coming, but because hearing them out loud made everything real. K.H. Lowe wrapped her arms around herself slightly. For a few minutes, sitting across from him, I wondered if maybe he was right. My chest tightened, but I didn't interrupt. I wondered if going back would be easier. Familiar. Safer. She turned toward me then, her eyes searching my face. But then something strange happened. "What?" I asked quietly. I realized I didn't feel the same way anymore. The wind picked up, pushing her hair across her face. She brushed it aside. "I kept comparing everything he said to you." I blinked. You. What? She nodded slowly. Lucas talked about what our life could be if I moved to New York. She gave a faint smile. But every future he described felt smaller than the one I imagine when I'm with you. For a moment I couldn't speak. K.H. Lowe took another step closer. I thought I wanted something easy, she continued. But easy is what I had before. And it broke me. Her voice cracked slightly. I don't want easy anymore, James. I want real. The words hung between us, heavy, honest, but then she hesitated. Fear flickered across her expression. I'm still scared, she admitted. Of what? That this might be another mistake. That maybe you're only here because my mother pushed you into it. That one day you'll realize you never actually wanted this. What? I stepped forward and gently took her hand. Her fingers were cold. K.H. Lowe, I said softly, I stopped doing things because of your mother a long time ago. She looked up at me. When we met that first night, I planned to leave after an hour. I remember. But then you smiled. And suddenly, I didn't want to leave. Her eyes softened slightly. I stayed because of you, I continued. Because every time we talked, I felt more like myself than I had in years. Because you challenge me. Because you make me laugh. Because you see the parts of me I usually hide. I squeezed her hand gently. I'm not here because of Victoria Langford. I'm here because of K.H. Lowe. For a second she looked like she might cry. You mean that? She whispered. I wouldn't be standing here in this freezing wind if I didn't. A small laugh escaped her through the emotion. Fair point. The tension that had been sitting between us for weeks finally seemed to crack. K.H. Lowe stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath in the cold air. I told Lucas something before I left, she said quietly. What? I told him I had already met someone who made me feel more alive in a few months than I had felt in 4 years. My heart skipped, and what did he say? He said I was making another mistake. And what do you think? She looked up at me, her green eyes steady. I think mistakes don't feel like this. I pulled her into my arms before either of us could overthink it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She rested her head against my chest, and the tension of the past 3 weeks seemed to melt away. We didn't kiss. We just stood there holding each other while the wind moved across the lake. Eventually, she looked up again. So, she said softly, what happens now? I smiled. Now we stop pretending. She nodded slowly. Now we do this for real. Exactly. Her fingers tightened slightly around mine. Together. Together. But there was still one person who deserved to hear the truth. Victoria Langford. 2 days later, K.H. Lowe and I sat across from her in her office. The Chicago River stretched behind her through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Victoria looked from me to K.H. Lowe calmly, one eyebrow slightly raised, waiting. K.H. Lowe spoke first. Mom, James, and I are together. What? For real. Not because you wanted it. Because we do. Victoria didn't respond immediately. She simply leaned back in her chair and studied us. The silence lasted long enough that I started wondering if I had made the biggest mistake of my career. Then something unexpected happened. Victoria smiled, not the sharp professional smile she used in negotiations, a real one. I know, she said simply. K.H. Lowe blinked. You know. Of course I know. Victoria gestured toward the two of us. You've been terrible at hiding it. I glanced at K.H. Lowe. She looked just as surprised as I felt. Victoria leaned forward slightly. I pushed the dinner, she admitted, but everything after that was your choice. Her eyes moved to me. James. Yes. What? You're one of the best people I've ever hired. And more importantly, she glanced briefly at her daughter. You're good for her. Relief spread slowly through my chest. I won't let you regret that. Victoria waved a hand dismissively. You'd better not. Then her expression shifted back to its usual sharp focus. Now get out of my office. Both of you. And for God's sake stop acting like teenagers sneaking around. K.H. Lowe laughed. For the first time in weeks, the sound felt light again. We left the office together. As the elevator doors closed, she looked at me and shook her head. I can't believe that just happened. Neither can I. She slipped her hand into mine. And for the first time since the night at the pier, everything felt steady again. But neither of us knew yet that the best part of our story was still waiting ahead. The night I proposed to K.H. Lowe started quietly. No dramatic speeches, no elaborate setup, just a cold November evening and a walk we had taken dozens of times before. But that night felt different from the moment we left our apartment. 1 year had passed since the night at Navy Pier when she told me she was scared of getting hurt again. 1 year since we decided to stop pretending. And somehow, over those 12 months, life had slowly rearranged itself around us. K.H. Lowe and I had moved into a small apartment in Chicago's West Loop. It wasn't huge, but it had tall windows that looked out over the river, and in the mornings, sunlight filled the living room like the city was waking up with us. For the first time in my life, coming home didn't feel like the end of a long workday. It felt like arriving somewhere I actually belonged. Work had changed too. 6 months after K.H. Lowe and I made things official, Victoria promoted me to Director of Client Strategy. At first I was worried people would assume the promotion came because I was dating the CEO's daughter, but Victoria shut that down quickly. You earned the job long before you started dating K.H. Lowe, she told me bluntly. If you didn't deserve it, you wouldn't have it. That was Victoria's version of reassurance. K.H. Lowe had been building something of her own too. She launched a small, sustainable design studio with 2 partners she trusted. The first months were brutal. Late nights, tight budgets, projects that almost fell apart before they were finished. But slowly the studio began gaining attention. Clients started recommending them. New contracts appeared. And for the first time in her life, K.H. Lowe was building something that belonged only to her. Not to her mother, not to anyone else, just her. Of course, life wasn't perfect. Some nights the past still caught up with us. K.H. Lowe would wake from a dream about Lucas or the pressure she felt growing up. Other nights I would lie awake worrying that one day she might realize she deserved someone better than me. But every time those fears appeared, we talked. We chose each other again and again. That's how relationships actually grow, not through perfect moments, but through the difficult ones. Which is why on that cold November evening I took K.H. Lowe back to the place where everything had changed. Navy Pier. She noticed immediately. We're here again. She asked with a small smile, thought it might be time. The tourist crowds had disappeared for the season. String lights stretched along the pier, reflecting softly across the dark water of Lake Michigan. The wind was cold enough that our breath fogged in the air as we walked. We reached the same spot where we had stood a year earlier, the same railing, the same view of the city glowing behind us. K.H. Lowe leaned against the railing. You know what's funny? She said. What? A year ago I stood right here telling you I was terrified. And now, she looked at me, now I'm just grateful. For what? For the fact that you stayed. Her words landed deeper than she probably realized, because staying had been the easiest decision of my life. I took a slow breath. K.H. Lowe. She turned toward me, and for the first time that evening she noticed the small velvet box in my hand. Her eyes widened slightly. James. I dropped to one knee before my nerves could talk me out of it. The cold wood of the pier pressed against my knee as I opened the box. Inside sat a simple diamond ring that caught the light from the string lamps above us. A ring I had carried in my coat pocket for almost 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. K.H. Lowe Langford, I said. My voice was steady even though my heart was racing. 1 year ago you stood right here and told me you were scared. Scared that what we had might be a mistake. She was already crying. I continued anyway. And I told you I wasn't going anywhere. Every day since then, I've chosen you. Not because your mother pushed us together. Not because it was easy, but because being with you makes my life better in every possible way. I swallowed once before finishing. You challenge me. You make me laugh. You make me braver than I used to be. I held the ring toward her, so I want to keep choosing you. For the rest of my life. K.H. Lowe, will you marry me? For a second she couldn't speak. She covered her mouth with both hands, laughing softly through tears. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, James. Of course I will. What? I slipped the ring onto her finger and stood up just as she wrapped her arms around my neck. This time we did kiss. The wind swirled around us while the city lights reflected across the lake behind her. And in that moment, I knew something with absolute certainty. This woman was the person I wanted beside me for every chapter that came next. Our wedding took place the following spring. Nothing extravagant, just a small ceremony in a garden overlooking Lake Michigan. Close friends, family. A warm afternoon filled with sunlight and nervous laughter. Victoria walked K.H. Lowe down the aisle, and when she placed her daughter's hand in mine, her usual composure cracked just slightly. You take care of her, she said quietly. I will, I promised, every day. Our vows were simple, honest. K.H. Lowe cried when I told her I fell in love with her courage and her stubborn refusal to let fear control her life. I cried when she said I had shown her it was safe to trust someone again. 2 years later, our daughter Lily was born. She had K.H. Lowe's green eyes, and unfortunately, my stubborn personality. Watching K.H. Lowe hold Lily for the first time changed something inside me. A kind of love I hadn't known existed suddenly became the center of my world. Life settled into a rhythm after that. K.H. Lowe continued growing her design studio. I eventually became vice president at Langford Media, but no matter how busy work became, every evening I came home, dinner together, bedtime stories, quiet moments after Lily fell asleep. Victoria softened too. She still ran her company like a general commanding an army, but whenever she held her granddaughter, the sharp edges disappeared. She would never admit it, but I knew she was proud of the life K.H. Lowe and I had built. Sometimes late at night, when the apartment was quiet and the city lights stretched endlessly outside our window, I thought back to the beginning. That one dinner, the blind date neither of us wanted. If I had refused Victoria one more time, if I had walked out after that first hour, if K.H. Lowe had chosen the familiar path instead of something new, none of this would exist. Not the woman sleeping beside me, not the little girl who now filled our home with laughter, not the life we built together piece by piece. All of it began with one reluctant dinner and one unexpected chance. Some people think love begins with fireworks or dramatic moments, but the truth is simpler than that. Sometimes love begins with something much smaller, an awkward blind date, a temporary alliance, and two people who decide to stay.